There's a kind of silence that settles into a house after 50 years of laughter, after 50 years of arguments over burnt toast and forgotten anniversaries, after 50 years of a love so deep and so constant that it becomes the very air you breathe. It's not an empty silence. No, sir. It's a full one. It's a silence that's heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 conversations, with the echoes of footsteps that used to pad down the hallway at 2 a.m. for a glass of water. It's a silence that hums with the memory of a voice you'd give your last dollar just to hear one more time. It's a silence that holds the warmth of a hand that used to reach for yours in the middle of the night, a quiet reassurance that you were never truly alone in this big, wide, confusing world. That was the kind of silence Carlos lived in. His house, a sturdy old colonial on Maple Street, with its peeling white paint and the porch swing that squeaked just so, was a monument to that kind of silence. It wasn't sad, not to him. It was sacred. It was the sanctuary he shared with Elena for 50 years, and even though she had been gone for 2 years now, that sanctuary was still alive with her. He could feel her in the way the morning sun hit the kitchen linoleum, warming the spot where she used to stand and flip pancakes with a flick of her wrist that was pure poetry. He could smell her in the faint, lingering scent of lavender and flower that had somehow seeped into the very walls, into the curtains, into the cushions of the old armchair where she used to read her novels. He could hear her in the gentle creak of the floorboards, a sound that seemed to say, "I'm still here, Carlitos. I'm still walking these halls with you." Carlos, at 78, was a man carved from granite and kindness. His hands were gnarled and spotted with age, the hands of a man who had worked a long, honest life at the city's waterworks, turning valves and reading meters in the freezing rain and the sweltering heat. His back was stooped, not just from age, but from the years of carrying the quiet burdens of family, of responsibility, of a love that demanded nothing but gave everything. His face was a roadmap of deep lines, each one telling a story, a crinkle near his eye from a joke Elena told that made him laugh so hard he cried, a deep furrow on his brow from the worry he felt when his son was overseas in the desert, a gentle sag at the corners of his mouth from the quiet acceptance of life's hard knocks and the slow, inevitable passing of time. But his eyes were still the color of warm, rich coffee, and they held a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. And behind those eyes lived a heart that had not hardened. It was a heart that ached, yes. It ached with the dull, persistent pain of a phantom limb. He would still turn in his chair to tell her a funny thing he'd seen on the television, only to remember there was no one there. He would still buy her favorite brand of orange marmalade at the grocery store, just to have the comfort of seeing it in the pantry. For him, Elena was a living presence, not a memory. She was a part of the furniture, a part of the air he breathed. And he kept the physical reminders of her life all around him, not as a morbid thing, but as a prayer. A prayer of gratitude for the time they had, for the life they built, for the love that had withstood every storm. Elena's corner was the sunroom. It was a charming, cluttered room that smelled of old paper and the faint, sweet dust of a lifetime. The sun would pour through the large bay window in the afternoons, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden fireflies. It was her sanctuary, a place where she would spend hours lost in her own world of creativity and comfort. There, in the corner, stood her pride and joy, a 1954 Singer sewing machine, the color of a deep, forest green, mounted on a sturdy wooden table with elegant, curved legs. It wasn't just a machine. It was an engine of love. That's where she sewed his work shirts, where she patched the knees of their sons' trousers, where she crafted quilts that kept them warm through countless Ohio winters. Its cast-iron foot pedal was worn smooth from her feet, the black paint rubbed off in places where her slippers had pressed down 1,000,000 times. When he pressed it with his own shoe, he could almost hear the gentle, rhythmic whirring that was the soundtrack of his life, a soft, hypnotic hum that had lulled him to sleep on many a lazy Sunday afternoon. The wooden spools of thread, still holding brightly colored remnants of cotton, were arranged in a small tin box next to it, a rainbow of her past projects. A small pincushion, shaped like a tomato, was stabbed with dozens of needles and pins, each one a tiny testament to her industry. Right next to the sewing machine, on a small, hand-knitted doily that his own mother had made, sat her recipe box. It was a humble thing, a simple wooden box with a faded floral design on the lid, the colors of the flowers worn and muted from years of handling. It was stained with grease and sugar and flour and, most of all, with love. The hinges were a little loose, and the clasp was a bit tarnished, but it was the most precious box in the world to Carlos. Inside were hundreds of index cards, each one written in her neat, flowing cursive. They were her legacy. The recipe for the pot roast that would make you weep with its savory richness, the snickerdoodle cookies that the whole neighborhood loved and would beg for at every bake sale, the secret to her famous apple pie with a flaky crust that melted in your mouth. Her handwriting, a part of her soul, was etched onto every single card. You could see the little flourishes she made on the letter Y and the way she dotted her I's with a tiny circle. She had even written little notes on some of them, like add a little more cinnamon for Carlitos or this one was a disaster. Don't forget the sugar. It was a diary of her life in the kitchen, a chronicle of the meals that had nourished her family for decades. And resting on the singer, draped over the arm where she would guide the fabric, was her shawl. It wasn't a fancy thing. It was a simple, cream-colored crocheted shawl made of soft, worn yarn. It was slightly yellowed with age, and the edges were frayed from years of use. She would drape it over her shoulders when the evenings got chilly, or when she was feeling a little under the weather, or just when she wanted to feel cozy and safe. It was the most comforting thing in the world, a symbol of warmth and her constant, nurturing presence. It smelled like her, like lavender and a faint hint of rose water and the clean, fresh scent of laundry dried on the line. Whenever Carlos held it, he could almost feel her arms around him, a phantom embrace that soothed his lonely soul. Every morning, for the past 2 years since she'd gone, Carlos's routine was unchanged. He would get up, make himself a cup of weak coffee just the way she liked it, with a splash of milk and a single spoonful of sugar. He would stand in the sunroom, in the silent company of her things, and he would talk to her. Not in a loud way. Just a low, gentle murmur, a stream of consciousness that flowed from his heart. He would tell her about the news, about the birds nesting in the eaves of the porch, about how much he missed her. He would tell her about the dreams he had the night before, about the little things that happened in his day. It was his private ritual, a sacred communion that kept the bond between them alive. It was his way of keeping her alive, of honoring the promise he had made to her when she was on her deathbed, holding his hand with her frail, cold fingers, her eyes bright with love and fear. She had whispered to him, her voice barely a breath, "Carlos. Promise me you won't be alone. Promise me you'll hold on to the good things." He had squeezed her hand and promised. And the good things, he decided, were all the memories locked in the objects she had touched. That sewing machine was her hands, tirelessly creating. The recipe box was her heart, pouring love into every meal. The shawl was her embrace, a constant source of warmth and comfort. They were not things to him. They were her. They were the tangible evidence of a life well lived, a love well shared. Which is why the story you're about to hear is one of the most profound, and then eventually, the most heart-wrenching and beautiful, stories of a man and his faith in the good that still lives in the world. It's a story about how a greedy hand can try to snatch away a treasure, but how a loving hand can build something even greater from its ruins. It is a story about the quiet, resilient power of the human spirit, and the extraordinary lengths a man will go to in order to protect the memories of the one he loved. Now, hold on, because the storm is about to break, and it will shake the very foundation of everything Carlos holds dear. It was a crisp Tuesday in October, the kind of day that makes you feel alive, with a sky so blue it hurt your eyes and a crispness in the air that smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The leaves on the old maple tree in the front yard were blazing with oranges and reds, a final, fiery declaration of life before the long, gray winter settled in. Carlos had his yearly checkup with Dr. Miller, a kind-faced man who had been his doctor for 30 years. It was just a routine thing. He'd get his blood pressure taken, have his heart listened to, and the doctor would tell him he was doing fine for a man his age, and he would go home feeling relieved, his small victory for the day. He had left the house at 11 in the morning, locking the door with his heavy iron key, his mind on the leftover meatloaf waiting for him in the fridge. He hummed a little tune, a song Elena used to love, as he walked down the front path, a contented smile on his face. He had no inkling of the horror that awaited him, no premonition of the theft that was about to rip the heart out of his home. What he didn't know was that while he was away, a key he had given to his grandson's mother, Trina, for emergencies, was being used for a purpose that was anything but helpful. Trina. Just saying the name made a sour taste form in Carlos's mouth. She was a woman, maybe 40, with sharp, impatient eyes that seemed to assess everyone and everything for their monetary value, and a voice that was always just a little too loud, a little too insistent, a little too shrill. She had married Carlos's son, Hank, years ago. Hank was a good man, kind and gentle like his mother, but he was a shell of a person after the divorce. Trina had run off with another man, a slick salesman who promised her the world and then promptly left her with a mountain of debt, leaving Hank devastated and taking their son, little Hank, with her. It was a bitter pill for Carlos to swallow, but he had swallowed it, for the sake of his grandson. He had tried to keep a relationship with the boy, but Trina made it difficult. She always looked at him like he was a relic, an inconvenience, a walking reminder of a past she wanted to forget. She thought his old ways were foolish, his attachment to the past unhealthy. She saw his home as a museum of junk, his love as a weakness, his memories as a burden. He had given her a key not out of trust, but out of necessity. He told her, "If I ever fall and can't get to the phone, you can get in." It was a simple, grim reality of old age, a concession to the vulnerability that comes with time. But at 11:30 that morning, Trina was not there to help her elderly father-in-law. She was there with a station wagon and a bad attitude, fueled by a desperate need for cash and a deep-seated resentment. She'd been in a foul mood all week. Her new husband was being distant, her credit card was maxed out, and she was tired of seeing her son mope around, always wanting to visit his grandfather, always talking about how kind and gentle he was. It made her feel inadequate, like she was being compared to this saintly old man and found wanting. She looked around the old house with disgust. It smelled like old people and mothballs and that cloying scent of lavender she associated with Elena. It was a house of the past, and she hated it. She saw the cluttered sunroom, with its piles of fabric and the endless boxes of old recipes, and she saw a fire hazard, a health risk, a total eyesore. What a fire hazard, she muttered to herself, a justification forming in her mind. She had heard Carlos's doctor had told him to start thinking about downsizing. Well, here was her chance to be helpful, to be proactive, to take charge of the situation. She marched into the sunroom, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor with an aggressive finality. She didn't see a shrine. She didn't see love. She saw junk. She saw an old, clunky sewing machine that was probably worth nothing, a dinosaur of a bygone era. She saw an old, tattered shawl that a homeless person wouldn't even want, a rag that should have been thrown out decades ago. She saw a box of stained, dusty old recipe cards, the handwriting faded and illegible. A 50-year-old hoard, she said, shaking her head with a tight little smirk, her lips curling in disdain. She knew someone who was having a garage sale down the street, a woman who was always looking for vintage junk to sell. She could make a quick buck. People were suckers for this stuff. They'd pay good money for nostalgia, for a piece of the past. She didn't pause for a second. She didn't let the weight of what she was doing sink in. She was a whirlwind of efficiency, a tornado of callousness. She didn't tenderly wrap the sewing machine. She just heaved the heavy Singer table across the floor, scraping the beautiful old hardwood, leaving deep, gouging marks that would never be repaired. With a grunt, she lugged the sewing machine itself, a heavy beast of cast iron and steel, into the back of her car, letting it clatter against the side. She grabbed the recipe box and the shawl and threw them in the back seat, like they were trash, like they meant nothing. An hour later, at the sale on Franklin Street, she sold everything to an antiques dealer for $200. It was a pittance, a sum that wouldn't even cover a new pair of shoes, but to her, it was $200 of pure profit. Free money for something that was worthless to her. She felt a sense of smug satisfaction, a feeling of having done something practical, something useful. She had cleared out the clutter, and she had made some cash. It was a win-win, as far as she was concerned. Meanwhile, Carlos was pulling into his driveway at 12:30. He parked his old, blue sedan and got out, feeling the cool autumn air on his face, the familiar scent of his neighborhood welcoming him home. He looked up at his house, his sanctuary, and something felt wrong. It was a subtle thing, a sixth sense, a prickling at the back of his neck. The front door was slightly ajar. His heart began to beat a little faster, a dull thudding in his chest. He shuffled up the steps, a sudden weakness in his knees, a feeling of dread washing over him. He pushed the door open. He walked into the house. It was quiet. Too quiet. This wasn't the comfortable, loving silence he was used to. This was a dead silence. A violated silence. A silence that screamed of an intrusion. He looked around the living room, his eyes scanning for the disruption, for the sign of what was wrong. Nothing seemed out of place. He looked down the hall towards the kitchen. Everything was as it should be. Then, a sickening dread filled his stomach, a cold, clammy feeling of terror. He slowly, haltingly, walked towards the sunroom, each step feeling like he was wading through thick mud. When he reached the doorway, his world shattered. The sunroom was empty. Not just tidy. Empty. Bereft. The very soul of the room had been ripped out. There was a large, dusty rectangular mark on the hardwood floor where the Singer sewing table had stood for over 30 years, a ghostly outline of his life. The beautiful, worn, green machine was gone. The little table with the recipe box was gone. The shawl, the one thing that held the essence of Elena's warmth, her scent, her very presence, was gone. He could see the faint indentations in the carpet where the legs of the table had been. The pincushion was gone. The spools of thread were gone. It was as if a giant hand had reached in and scooped out the heart of his home, leaving a hollow, gaping wound. Carlos couldn't breathe. He felt a cold tremor run through his entire body, A shiver that started in his spine and radiated outwards. A sharp pain pricked at his chest, a phantom echo of a heart attack, a physical manifestation of his emotional agony. He staggered backward, clutching the doorframe, his knuckles white. He looked around, desperately, as if he expected them to reappear, as if it were all a terrible dream. He opened his mouth to call out, to ask her why, but the only sound that came out was a raw, ragged sob that tore from the depths of his soul. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He found his phone and his fingers were trembling so violently he could barely dial. He pressed the button for Trina, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Trina," he managed to say when she answered, his voice cracking, a desperate plea in his tone. "Trina. My wife's things. They're gone. The sewing machine. The recipes. Her shawl. Did you come by? Did you see anyone? Did you see someone break in?" He was praying it was a stranger, a random thief, anyone but her. There was a pause on the line. A cold, calculated, heartless pause. Then Trina's voice came through, sharp and dismissive, laced with an infuriating nonchalance. "Oh, that. Yeah, I cleared that junk out for you. You should be thanking me. The place was starting to look like a hoarder's den. I sold it all for $200. You're too old to be hoarding junk, Carlos. You need to move on. Get a hobby or something." The words hit Carlos like physical blows. Junk. Move on. He felt his entire world tilt on its axis, the floor seeming to drop out from beneath him. The few tangible, physical connections he had to his wife of 50 years, the only things that helped him keep his promise to her, were gone. Sold. For a measly $200. By his own daughter-in-law. He stood there in the empty room, the silence now a crushing weight, an oppressive, suffocating presence. He was utterly, completely alone. He held the phone in his hand, the dial tone buzzing in his ear, a mocking, relentless sound. He looked at the place where the recipe box used to be. He remembered Elena, smiling, her hands dusted with flour, her face glowing with a mother's love, handing him a warm cookie and saying, "This one's for you, mi amor." He remembered the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. He remembered the sound of the sewing machine on a quiet evening, a lullaby that had accompanied his reading. He dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor. He couldn't even cry. The tears were there, burning behind his eyes, but he was too shocked, too hollowed out to let them fall. He just stood there, a 78-year-old man, in the middle of a room full of ghosts, his life's treasure stolen by the very person he had trusted, the person he had let into his home. And that was the moment the seed was planted. It wasn't a seed of anger, not at first. It was a seed of deep, profound despair, a despair so absolute it threatened to swallow him whole. For a long time, he just sat in his chair, staring at the bare wall, the empty space. He felt like a failure. He couldn't protect the one thing that mattered most to him. He had let Elena down. He had broken his promise. But as the evening wore on, as the shadows lengthened and the house grew dark, a new feeling began to grow. It was a cold, hard knot in his stomach, a feeling of being wronged, of having been violated in the most intimate way possible. It was a slow, burning fire of injustice that began to consume his despair. He replayed her words over and over in his mind, the casual cruelty of them. "You're too old to be hoarding junk. Move on." Who was she to tell him to move on? Who was she to put a price tag on the life he had built, the love he had cherished, the 50 years of shared history that she had just dismissed as trash? The audacity of it was breathtaking, a monstrous act of disrespect. That was when the revenge began to form. It wasn't a revenge of violence, or shouting, or anger. He was too old, too weary, too heartbroken for that. It was a quiet, methodical, and deeply profound revenge. It was a revenge born not from hate, but from a desperate, burning desire to prove that what she had thrown away was priceless, that her $200 was a gross insult to a treasure worth more than all the money in the world. He made a decision. He would not let her win. He would not let his last memories of his wife be tarnished by the greedy hands of a woman who understood nothing of love or loss. He would get them back. Even if it took everything he had. He would reclaim his past, and in doing so, he would expose the emptiness of her soul. The next morning, instead of his usual quiet routine of coffee and conversation with the empty sunroom, Carlos put on his best pair of trousers, the ones he wore to church, and a clean, button-down shirt, the one Elena had always said made him look handsome. He combed his thin, white hair with meticulous care. His movements were slow, but they were deliberate, filled with a new, quiet determination. There was a new steel in his eyes, a cold, hard glint that replaced the previous softness. He got into his old sedan and drove to the neighborhood where the garage sale had been, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He spent the entire morning talking to people, knocking on doors, asking if anyone remembered a woman selling an old sewing machine and a box of recipes. He was polite, but persistent, his voice calm but his eyes betraying his desperation. He must have visited 30 houses, getting the same answer: "No, sorry, can't help you." Finally, a neighbor, an old man sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, told him he had seen a woman matching Trina's description selling to a dealer named Silas, who owned an antique shop on the outskirts of town, the Rusty Nail. Carlos drove straight there, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The shop was a dark, dusty cavern filled with old furniture and bric-a-brac, a labyrinth of forgotten things. It smelled of old wood and lemon polish and the faint, musty scent of time. A bell jingled as he entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. A kind-faced man with a shock of white hair and wire-rimmed glasses emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. This was Silas. He was the antithesis of Trina, a man who respected the past, a man who understood the value of history and sentiment. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice gentle and curious. Carlos took a deep breath, steeling himself. His voice was thick with emotion, but he kept it steady, telling his story with a raw, heartbreaking honesty. He explained, slowly and carefully, about the sewing machine, the recipe box, the shawl. He told Silas they belonged to his late wife, Elena, and that they were all he had left of her. He spoke about his grief, his daily routine, the comfort they brought him in his lonely old age. He spoke of his promise to her, of the love that had defined his entire adult life. He didn't accuse. He didn't blame. He just told the truth, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his voice cracking with emotion. Silas listened, his face growing serious, his eyes filled with sympathy. He walked to the back of the shop and came back a moment later, pushing the old green singer out of the shadows. Carlos's heart leapt into his throat. There it was. He could see the faint, worn spot on the table from Elena's hand, the scratches on the base where she had rested her feet, the tiny nick in the paint where she had once dropped a needle. It was like seeing an old friend, a lifeline to his past. "The lady told me it was her stuff to sell," Silas said, shaking his head with a sad sigh. "I'm sorry, sir. I wouldn't have bought it if I'd known the real story." She seemed desperate. He had sold the shawl and the recipe box to another dealer, a woman named Miriam who owned a vintage clothier in the next town over. But the sewing machine was still there, waiting for its rightful owner. "How much?" Carlos asked, his voice a whisper, his throat tight. Silas sighed, doing some mental calculations. "I paid $200 for the whole lot. But I can't sell you just the machine for that. I have to make a profit. I have a business to run." They haggled, a gentle negotiation, and Silas, seeing the desperate, pleading look in the old man's eyes, gave him a fair price. Carlos paid him $800 for the sewing machine. It was a huge chunk of his pension, almost all of it, the money he had been saving for a rainy day. He carefully loaded the heavy machine into the back of his car, treating it with a reverence he would show a newborn child. He didn't stop there. He drove to the next town, to Miriam's shop, a charming little boutique filled with vintage clothing and delicate linens. He was exhausted, his body aching, his spirit frayed, but he pushed on, driven by a force he couldn't name. He repeated his story to Miriam, a plump, sympathetic woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor who looked at him with such pity in her eyes, her heart going out to this poor, broken man. "The shawl and the recipes?" she said, her voice soft as velvet. "I was going to sell them for the material and the nostalgia. The shawl is lovely, the craftsmanship is exquisite. I was going to put it on a mannequin." She had kept them, waiting to be displayed in her front window. Carlos saw the recipe box on a shelf, tucked away in a corner, looking as lost and forlorn as he felt. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his fingers tracing the faded floral design on the lid. It was his wife. It was her life. He could feel her in the weight of it, in the familiar texture of the wood. "This is all I have," he said, his voice finally breaking, tears streaming down his face. "I don't have much money. I just paid $800 for the sewing machine. That was my whole month's pension. I have almost nothing left." Miriam looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. She looked at the shawl, then back at his face, etched with a lifetime of love and sorrow, a face that told a story of profound loss and unwavering devotion. She saw the good in him, the pure, unadulterated love that still burned in his heart. She sighed, a long, slow exhalation of resignation and compassion. "Take them," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Take them all. For $200. And a promise. You promise me you'll take care of them. You'll honor her memory." Tears finally streamed down Carlos's weathered cheeks, falling like rain onto the recipe box. He thanked her, his voice a hoarse, trembling whisper, overwhelmed by her kindness. He carefully wrapped the shawl and the recipe box in a soft cloth she provided and carried them out of the shop like a crown jewel, like a sacred relic. He had spent his entire pension, $1,000, to buy back his own life, to reclaim his past from the clutches of a thoughtless, greedy soul. He went home. He put everything back in the sunroom, placing each item in its exact spot, as if restoring a sacred altar. He draped the shawl on the sewing machine, his fingers lingering on the soft, worn yarn. He opened the recipe box and looked at her handwriting, the familiar loops and curves bringing a fresh wave of tears. The wave of relief that washed over him was so powerful, it made his knees weak, and he sank into his old armchair, clutching the recipe box to his chest like a life preserver. And for the first time in 2 days, he wept. He wept for the violation, for the loss, for the sheer terror of almost losing everything. He wept with a profound, bone-deep gratitude that his memories were safe, that his promise to Elena had been fulfilled. He had his revenge, or so he thought. He had taken back what was rightfully his. He had proven that his love was stronger than her greed. But that was only the beginning. The true revenge, the kind that would shake the very foundations of Trina's world, was yet to come. He had won the battle. He had recovered his treasures. But the war against the cold, uncaring heart that had tried to destroy them had just begun. He realized that buying them back was a personal victory. Trina needed to understand what she had tried to do, and more importantly, why it was so profoundly wrong. That night, as he sat in the quiet of his restored sunroom, he had an idea. An idea so audacious, so beautiful, and so perfectly conceived, it was as if Elena herself had whispered it into his ear, her voice a gentle breeze in his mind. The next morning, he didn't go to his sunroom. He made some phone calls. He went to the bank and withdrew the last of his savings, a small, sad sum. He went downtown and found a small, empty storefront that used to be a bakery. It had large windows that let in a flood of warm, welcoming light. The floor was worn linoleum, but it was clean and swept. He rented it. It cost him almost nothing, a pittance compared to the emotional rent he had already paid. It was a small, unassuming space, a blank canvas waiting for a masterpiece. For the next week, Carlos worked tirelessly, his old body aching with every movement, but his spirit soaring. He got a small table and placed the Singer sewing machine on top of it, polishing the brass until it gleamed. He bought a cheap display case and put the recipe box inside, open to a page with Elena's handwriting, showing her beautiful cursive. He found a simple mannequin and draped the shawl over its shoulders, adjusting it with the care of a curator. He didn't have much money left, but he had something more valuable. He had faith. Faith in the goodness of people, faith in the power of memory, faith in the love that had sustained him for 50 years. He hand-painted a sign on a large piece of wood and hung it above the door. It read, Elena's Memory Room. Below that, in smaller, neat letters, he painted, everything here was almost thrown away by someone who didn't understand love. If you have a memory you thought was lost, come sit. We will not forget together. On opening day, Carlos unlocked the door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm in his chest. He didn't know if anyone would come. He just sat there, on a simple wooden chair next to Elena's sewing machine, feeling the weight of his decision. For the first hour, no one came. He could hear the gossip going around town, the whispers, the curious glances. But then, an elderly lady, Mrs. Gable, who lived on his street, walked in. She was a widow, too, a woman who knew the sting of loss. She looked around, her eyes landing on the shawl, and a soft, sad smile touched her lips. She looked at the recipes, her gaze lingering on the familiar handwriting. She sat down on the chair next to Carlos, her presence a comfort. Carlos, she said gently, her voice like honey. I just want you to know. My husband. He used to love my apple pie. When I make it, it's like he's right there in the kitchen with me. I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Carlos nodded, a lump in his throat. He didn't say a word. He just smiled and pointed to the recipe box, showing her one of Elena's recipes for a pie crust. The magic was happening. The connection was being made. That was the spark. Mrs. Gable went home and told her friends, her heart full of the warmth she had felt. The next day, a few more people came, curious old souls drawn by the quiet dignity of the place. The local newspaper, a small weekly paper that chronicled the lives of the townsfolk, caught wind of the story. They ran a small article with a picture of Carlos sitting next to the sewing machine, his face serene, his hands resting on the wooden table. The headline read, A widower's love, a museum to his late wife, and a lesson to us all. It was the article that changed everything. It was picked up by a local television station, a human interest piece that tugged at the heartstrings of the entire region. They did a touching news segment, showing Carlos talking about Elena, his voice steady, his eyes glistening. Carlos was a sensation. He didn't want fame. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to connect with people, to share his love story. And they came. They came in droves, from all over the state. But not just to look. They came to donate. People started bringing their own treasures, their own memories, to Elena's memory room. A man donated his father's old, scratched pocket watch, the one his father would check every few minutes, a silent testament to a life of punctuality. A woman brought in her grandmother's hand-sewn wedding dress, a delicate masterpiece of lace and hope. A young boy, whose grandfather had just passed away, brought a favorite fishing lure, a simple thing that held the memory of 1,000 afternoons on the lake. The room was filling with stories, with love, with the echoes of lives well lived. It was then that Carlos, the old man who had almost lost everything, began the quietest, most powerful revenge of all. He was building a monument to love, and in doing so, he was exposing the emptiness of Trina's actions, the coldness of her heart, the poverty of her soul. He never said a bad word about her. He never told the reporters how she had stolen his things, how she had tried to destroy his past. He just said, "I kept my way. She lost hers." The implication was powerful enough, a gentle condemnation that spoke louder than any accusation. The story grew, spreading like wildfire. A regional paper did a feature, a long, detailed piece that chronicled Carlos's journey from loss to redemption. Then, the big news came. A national news network, one of the major ones, wanted to do a piece on the man who built a museum to his wife. Meanwhile, Trina was seething. She had been humiliated, everyone knew the story, and everyone knew it was her, the daughter-in-law who had sold off a dead woman's belongings for a pittance. Her attempts to justify it were met with cold stares and outright hostility. Her friends stopped talking to her. She became a pariah in her own small community, a cautionary tale of greed and callousness. One day, she saw the news crew setting up in front of Elena's memory room, the bright lights and cameras a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the place. She walked over, her face red with rage, her eyes blazing with fury. She tried to confront Carlos, to force him to tell the world the real story. She stood on the sidewalk, her voice shrill and accusatory, drawing a crowd of onlookers. "Carlos!" she shrieked, her words dripping with venom. "You're making a fool of me. You need to tell them you bought that stuff back. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was just trying to help. You're a crazy old man. You need to get over it." Carlos just looked at her, his eyes calm, his expression serene, a profound peace radiating from his weathered face. The news cameras were rolling, capturing every moment. A crowd was gathering, watching the drama unfold. He walked over to the window, slowly, deliberately, and pointed to the sign he had painted with such love and care. He didn't say a word. He just let her read it. Everything here was almost thrown away by someone who didn't understand love. The cameras captured her face perfectly, the realization, the shame, the utter humiliation that washed over her, draining the color from her cheeks. She stood there, helpless, her anger deflated like a punctured balloon. She couldn't fight against a man who refused to fight back. She couldn't attack a man who only held love in his heart. She saw her son, little Hank, in the crowd, his eyes filled with a deep, profound disappointment. That was the final blow, the one that shattered her resolve. She turned and fled, her plan of confrontation backfiring spectacularly, leaving her utterly defeated. But the deeper revenge, the one that would truly settle the score and bring a new beginning, was yet to come. It came in the form of a 16-year-old boy. Little Hank was a good kid, quiet and thoughtful, just like his father and grandfather. He had seen everything. He saw his mother's callousness, her disregard for anything that didn't have a price tag. He saw his grandfather's love, his unwavering devotion, his quiet strength. He saw the kindness of the community, the outpouring of support. He was so sick of the greed, the pettiness, the constant talk of money that filled his mother's house. He didn't want to live in a house of dust and silence, a house where love was a sign of weakness and emotion was a liability. One evening, a few days after the news report, he walked into Elena's memory room, the bell above the door jingling softly. The place was quiet, peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of the evening light. Carlos was sitting there, gently polishing the brass cover of the singer, his movement slow and meditative. The kid stood in the doorway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his head bowed. "Grandpa?" he said, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with emotion. Carlos looked up, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Hanky," he said, using his old nickname for his grandson, a name he hadn't used in years. "Grandpa. Can I stay with you?" The boy's voice was cracking, tears welling in his eyes. "I don't want to go home. She doesn't understand. She doesn't understand anything. She only talks about what things cost. You taught me that things don't matter. But memories do. Mom taught me that money is all that matters. I want to be here with you. I choose you." Carlos felt a lump in his throat the size of a baseball, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked him over. He stood up, walked over to his grandson, and pulled him into a tight, fierce embrace, holding him as if he would never let go. It was a hug 50 years in the making, a hug that said everything he could never put into words. He had won. He hadn't just gotten his revenge. He had gotten his grandson. He had proven, without a doubt, the power of love over greed, the power of memory over money. He had built a temple to memory, and in doing so, he had rescued a soul from the clutches of a materialistic world. The final act of this beautiful, profound story takes place the next morning. Carlos's routine had changed. He no longer sat alone in his sunroom, talking to ghosts. Now, at 7 in the morning, he walks down the street, his grandson by his side, to Elena's memory room. He can hear the hum of the city waking up, the distant sound of traffic, the chirping of birds in the trees. The air is crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the coming winter. He unlocks the door, and the familiar smell of old paper and wood and love greets him. As he walks inside, his routine is the same. He does not go to the sewing machine, not yet. He walks to the back of the small museum, past the donated treasures, past the stories of strangers. There, in a quiet, unassuming corner, sits a small, locked glass display case. It is the only thing in the room that is locked. Inside the case, there is just one object. It's the shawl. His wife's shawl. He keeps it locked up now. He unlocks the case with a tiny, delicate key he wears on a chain around his neck, a key that has become as much a part of him as his wedding ring. He takes the shawl out, his movements slow and reverent, treating it with the utmost care. He holds it to his face, burying his nose in the soft, worn yarn, and for a moment, he closes his eyes. He is transported. He is a young man again, and Elena is beside him, safe and warm, her laughter echoing in his ears. He looks at his grandson, who is watching him, not with pity, but with a deep, profound admiration. A boy who is learning from a man who understands that the heart is a muscle that must be exercised with love every single day. Carlos presses the shawl to his lips, a silent kiss to his wife. He doesn't display it for the public. It is not for the visitors. It is his. It is the one object he never displays. It stays in his pocket, a constant comfort, or wrapped around his shoulders on those quiet, rainy mornings before the shop opens. It is his connection to her, his personal memory, his private revenge on a world that too often forgets what truly matters. He folds it carefully and puts it back in the case, his fingers lingering on the soft fabric. He locks it with a soft click, a sound of finality and protection. He turns to his grandson and sees the future. He sees a cycle being broken, a legacy of love being passed on. He sees a young man who will grow up knowing that love is the most valuable currency there is, a young man who will never make the same mistakes as his mother. He looks around the room, filled with the donated memories of strangers, each one a silent testament to the resilience of the human heart. He had taken revenge. Not by lashing out, not by causing pain, but by building something so beautiful, so powerful, so utterly transcendent, that it left the one who wronged him utterly isolated and alone. The revenge was in the contrast. The revenge was in the love. But as he looks at the recipe box, the handwriting of his wife, the comfort of his grandson, the pain isn't fully gone. It's a different kind of pain now. It's a reflective pain, a quiet ache in his soul. He realized, as he sat there in the quiet of the morning, that in his quest to right a wrong, he had been so focused on proving Trina wrong, on proving his love was greater than her greed, that he had almost forgotten the other half of the story. He remembered that before the sale, when Trina came to his house with the letter her lawyer had prepared, before the callous act, she had actually come to him. She had come to his house one evening, a few weeks before the garage sale. She had been crying, her makeup smudged, her eyes red and puffy. She had said she was sorry for the way she treated Carlos, at the time, had been so angry about the past, so hurt by her treatment, that he had turned her down. He had told her, "You have to manage your own affairs. I can't keep bailing you out." He had sent her away, cold and dismissive. Now, sitting in his museum, the weight of that memory crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't just gotten his revenge. He had been given a chance, a golden opportunity to show her grace, to be the bigger man, to extend a hand of compassion. And he had squandered it. He had a chance to show her grace, to be the bigger man, to help her. And he had sent her away. The revenge felt hollow, a Pyrrhic victory that left him feeling empty inside. Trina's actions were born from a lifetime of feeling unloved, of feeling like she never measured up, of a desperate need for money and security that she couldn't find in her own marriage. She had been drowning, a woman in over her head, and he had been so focused on his own pain that he hadn't seen it. The revenge he had exacted, the public humiliation, the loss of her son. It was a victory, yes, but it came at a terrible price. It was a victory that was tainted with the knowledge that he could have done things differently. He could have saved her too. He could have healed her, not just defeated her. He looked at his grandson. He had saved him. But what about Trina? What was the point of a revenge that left her broken, his grandson with a broken mother, and his own soul feeling burdened by a missed opportunity to forgive? The museum was his revenge. But the true story, the one that would echo through time, was not one of triumph over an enemy. It was a story of a man who, having taken his revenge, felt the profound, soul-crushing weight of what that revenge had cost. The revenge he had taken was so complete, so thorough, that it left him alone in his victory. He had exacted his revenge. He had proven his point. But the feeling was empty. It was like a beautiful, pristine, empty room. All his love, all his memory, was there, but it was missing the one thing that could have made it truly whole, the act of mercy. The act of forgiveness. And so, the story of Carlos does not end with a triumphal crescendo. It ends with a quiet, reflective hum. The museum is a success, a beacon of hope and love. But every morning, as he holds his shawl, he isn't just remembering Elena. He's remembering the choice he made to reject Trina's apology. He is thinking of what could have been, of the redemption that had been within his grasp. He feels the pain of not showing the same mercy to Trina that he had shown to the world. He looks at the story of Elena's memory room. It is a story of profound love, of resilience, of the power of memory. But it's also a cautionary. It's the one where you realize the greatest victory is not in proving them wrong, but in forgiving them, in extending a hand of compassion to those who have wronged you. Carlos learned that lesson, perhaps too late for Trina, but in time for the rest of his life. His revenge became a reflection, a mirror to his own soul, showing him his own flaws and failings. He now spends his days not thinking about the victory, but about the missed opportunity to show grace, the chance to heal a broken soul that he had let slip through his fingers. The story of the garage sale of memories is a wonderful, triumphant story, but it is also a profoundly human one. It shows us that the sweetest revenge is often not the one we take, but the peace we find when we realize that the battle was never truly about winning. It was about protecting what we love, and remembering that those who try to destroy it are often the ones who need our love the most. And so, Carlos, the keeper of memories, became the keeper of a quiet, reflective sorrow. He built his museum, but the most important room in it was the one he kept locked inside himself, the room where he remembered his own failings, his own missed chances at compassion. It is a story of triumph, a story of love, and ultimately, a story of the quiet, enduring power of reflection, a reminder that the greatest victory is not the defeat of an enemy, but the conquest of our own hearts. And that's the story. Carlos, his grandson, the museum. It's all true. A reminder that our memories are our greatest treasure, and the world tries to sell them off for a song. But the real treasure is in keeping them, in building them, and in understanding the heavy, reflective price of a victory won without mercy. The pain of taking revenge is often far greater than the pain of the initial wound. It's a lesson that echoes through the quiet halls of Elena's memory room, a lesson written in the faded ink of a recipe card, a lesson woven into the soft, worn yarn of a cream-colored shawl. And it's a lesson that will stay with you, long after the last words fade into the silence. So remember, when you are wronged, when the world tries to steal your treasure, protect what you love, but never forget the power of mercy. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge is not the one you take, but the peace you find within yourself.